Thanks and good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you this morning. This is not exactly a technical presentation because it dives around a whole bunch of topics that I hope are of as much interest to the folk in the Aaron community around address policy making as it would be to the folk in Nanog around the area of making it all work. So I'd like to talk a little bit about address exhaustion, but let me first give you some context. You know, we're all part of an industry that has existed for an awfully long time. The first time we tried to actually transmit information down copper wires for profit and fun was probably around 1836, 1837, and we figured out that if we could make and break the connection, it made a lot like Morse code, and up came wireless telegraphy. Took over the world and actually changed the world enormously. I live in Australia, and in around 1860, news from London and the dear old Queen used to take by express boat 90 days. When the first telegraph got put in, news from the dear Queen only took 2 days by telegraph. It was amazing. It transformed society. Of course, it was transformational in many other ways. Each telegram cost the equivalent of 3 weeks' working wages. And because a lot of the telegraph stations were manual and through the Middle East were staffed by folk who spoke Pashtun rather than English, the bit error rate was up around 40%. But nevertheless, it transformed the place. But then we figured out not just to go dit, dit, dit and da, 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 we figured out how to speak down those copper wires. And all of a sudden in 1876 the world changed again. By 1984 in America, AT&T was the world's largest corporation. This industry was massive. It still is. It dominated the entire world. And we have created an astonishing history. And by the most part, we have been amazingly successful at what we're doing, with some notable stuff-ups. Anyone remember ISDN? It was crap. There's no other way to describe it. The telephant's view of how computers should talk to each other was just bonkers. It never stood a hope. And if you really want the absolute epitome of why design by committee is complete waste of time, look no further than ATM. It was and is a complete disaster. It never stood a chance. And those poor folks still running it today, you have my sympathy. What can I say? The cause is hopeless. Give up. And of course, the things that succeeded never succeeded by design. The stuff that truly revolutionised our lives in recent times was accidental. SMS, guys, was never meant to happen. 140 bytes is not enough to say anything meaningful. Just look at Twitter. And the whole IP thing was not a planned conquest of the world. It was an experiment. We were just trying to figure out how to make OSI better, weren't we? The industry, despite its size, was never good at getting things right. And so when you look at the challenges we're facing today, how are we going to do with the latest challenge? Because in running out of v4 addresses and trying to bridge the gap across to v6, it's not clear to me, at any rate, that we're going to do this with accuracy, precision and success. To my mind, it's still a bit open as to which way that's going to go. Now, you know, the first kind of question when you get that is, you know, Geoff, you're just obsessing about crap, mate. You know, do you really have to worry about this kind of stuff? I'm like, surely it's just going to happen. Surely when we exhaust v4, surely that's the only option for this planet, right? Once the pressure on v4 exhaustion gets high enough, then v6 is simply going to happen. I've seen it on your mailing lists. I've seen it on mailing lists all over the planet. All you have to do is wait. Exhaustion is going to drive v6 deployment. Or is that just meaningless mantra? Is that just stuff we recite to ourselves as some optimistic hope without substance? Is the industry going to follow that plan or not? So when you look at this and you kind of think, what things in the past were inevitable? And is this one of them? You know, the first way we tried to do telephony was by wires. And the more people wanted to talk, the more wires you had to string up. And this is what New York got to sometime in whenever it was back then. That the real limiting factor was A, putting enough copper in long strands, and B, getting enough wood up there to hold all the copper up in the air. And quite frankly, the engineering nightmare of stringing another wire up for the next subscriber must have been phenomenal. So of course from then, the move to virtual circuits from where we sit today was completely inevitable. There was no more space in the air for more copper. So then we moved to virtual circuits. You know, the problem is, of course, getting a picture of virtual circuits, so, you know, blank screen, sorry. And from then on, we moved to packets. And again, I'm sorry, there's no picture of packets. They don't have a physical thing. But that progression from wires to virtual circuits to packets, each time the inevitability and the acceptability looks obvious. Because virtual circuits made the conversation at least 1,000 times cheaper. And IP itself, when you strip out everything, it wasn't the beauty of the protocol. Just about any other packet switching protocol would have done the job. Except AppleTalk, that was shit. Apart from AppleTalk, almost any other protocol would have done it because packets are cheaper than circuits. That whole timing thing and setup actually made networking cheaper. So this progress of inevitability was actually a progress too of economics. Networking for consumers became cheaper each time that happened. So if you think of this progress as inevitable, what do we have to do this time? We have to go from IPv4 to IPv6. Simple, yes? It's just more bits in the header. Yes? Of course. Except for that air gap. Then a miracle occurs right in that air gap. But it's not a miracle. It's not a miracle because you guys are definitionally lazy. For this industry, it is a bit bizarre. I worked for a while in Telstra in Australia, and in 1987 they set up their Y2K committee. This is an industry that normally takes planning to obsessive excess. But not this time. Oh no, not this time. We've done nothing. And we've watched the available V4 space dribble away to nothing. And all of our wonderful plans to simultaneously run V4 and V6 together while slowly moving all the payload from one truck to the other while in flight have disappeared to dust. You can't do that anymore. There are no more V4 addresses. So now, in the V4 world, you're going to have to get creative. Asking an engineer or a software engineer to get creative only results in nightmares. Look at NATs. But you're going to have to look at NATs because that's the first resort of the desperate. So from where we are, over the next few years, as you try to not only somehow grapple with V6, but make those last few addresses in V4 last even longer, carrier-grade NATs are going to be what you're lining up in front of the vendor door to buy. But that's not going to stop there. We're going to also have to figure out that we're going to do new things with content distribution networks, because all of a sudden, hiding behind a data center and serving the planet doesn't work when end-to-end is a historical myth. In V4, that strategy won't work anymore. All of a sudden, every content provider has to splash their content everywhere themselves. The network won't help. And then if you think that's challenging, when we really, really run out of addresses, that wonderful invention of the 1980s is going to enjoy a disgusting renaissance. And the word application level gateway will be part of our lingua franca. We're stuffed. We're stuffed because of another factor as well. Because the dream is that this is temporary. We're going to build all this stuff and then rip it out on Thursday. Because on Thursday we would have done the transition. You don't need it anymore. Or will we? because this is the first time when we're actually requiring the carriage provider to make massive new investments in capital infrastructure inside their network. And if you talk to any of these carriage providers these days, the networking business is not one that has gold-plated taps in the bathroom anymore. The average revenue per user out there in DSL land is less than $2 a month. If they ring up your help centre, you've just lost that revenue for the next year. Trying to spend money inside your network to do a transition is financially a nightmare. And if you buy that equipment, you're not going to rip it out on Thursday. As soon as you put it in, you're going to go to extraordinary lengths to keep it there, and to keep it working, and to make it better, and to realise the value of that investment over much longer time. And after a while, the word transition will have disappeared from your mindset. You will have forgotten. Because once you spend those millions of dollars, that will be an integral part of your business planning rather than a mere transitional excursion. So this transition, rather than a little loop, starts to look a lot more like a black hole. And if there is any Hawking radiation coming out, it's going to come out at random. And the point at which you exit might not necessarily be a vector that leads you on to V6. The real risk is that you're going to come out in a completely different direction. How real is that? I'm like, it's great as a piece of slideware. How real is it? What are the tensions that produce uncertainty here? Is this really a case that IPv4 could, in some strange, crippled and bizarre way, be made to last forever? Let me kind of go sideways for a bit, because I just want to digress out here, because it's fun, and kind of contemplate with you for just a few seconds, could you really make IPv4 last forever? If you were forced, if your arm was twisted, would it work? Well, let's kind of have a look a bit, and let me start from a different direction. How much V6 is out there? How much V6 is really, really out there? If you actually have a look at the routing table and have a look at the autonomous systems that advertise, originate and transit V6 and map those numbers back into V4, what you find in V4 is around 6,000 autonomous system numbers are transit for the others. And the other 29,000 or so are actually stubs. Let's just have a look at those transit folk, the folk in V4 who provide services. Almost half today, yesterday actually, 39% of those folk are actually dual stack capable, at least from the outside. The transit industry has got the message. Either that or the transit industry, it's easy. We really don't have many routers. You actually have an extraordinary amount of technical capability because you can afford it. Your users are ISPs who they claim are technically competent. It kind of works. You can do V6 and a lot of you have. This is great. At the other side of the equation, what you're staring at in front of you, my guess is that every single one of you at the moment have a V6 stack in that silicon operating right now. Anyone running XP? Well, there you go. All the rest of you have it. Because the only stacks that don't are actually the ones on XP that didn't actually manually turn it on. When we push you, when we actually give you a URL that doesn't contain any DNS, that actually just contains a V6 literal, 1/2 of the entire internet today desperately dust off their Teredo or whatever they're doing for tunneling and try desperately hard to send me a packet. 1/2 of the internet's end devices have 6 now. And the rest of you are running XP. Good luck. So what's the disconnect? If all of the transit and most of the end devices are running it, what else is going on in the middle? This is a graph produced by Google of the amount of folk who use V6 in a dual stack context. It spans, if my aging eyes can work this right, from about 2009 till today. I'd like to say it's one of those traditional up and to the right curves, but I'm lying. There's a little bit of upness, and its upness, it goes from 0.1% to an amazing highlight in IPv6 week of 0.35%. I've done a similar set of measurements at APNIC that farms across a whole bunch of folk, and I don't see anything different. It's up and to the right, but up and to the right in fractions. No one could ever call that good news. That somehow, between transit and the device, there's a massive air gap, and only 0.3% of you are able to jump it, and the rest of you can't. Because only 0.3% of the internet is actually able to take advantage of V6 when given the choice. What's the problem? Where's the structural brokenness in here? Well, it's the last mile access, isn't it? Obviously, it's the last mile access. Because these days, the operating system folk have got it right. Auto-tunneling sucks. It's an invention from hell. So that they only turn on V6 when the access provider delivers it. Then, and only then, will they prefer to use it. So why aren't the access providers turning it on? I offer you some choices, based largely on what I've been hearing at NANOG over the years, and in listening to various presentations, each of these choices has some credibility. But let's be nice here. Let's be nice. You're not really that stupid, because $1 trillion industry is not stupid by intent. We do employ extremely smart people somewhere. And a lot of what we do, ultimately, does have serious intent. And the serious issue here is not because we're stupid, lazy and uninformed. We are broke. We are really broke. And that means we don't have an awful lot of freedom to engage in risky ventures because we're broke. So the regime here right now makes V6 really, really unattractive as an investment. Because no matter how much money as access providers you spend in V6, no matter how many dollars you pump in, and don't forget, your revenue margin from the user is at most $2 a month. And the first time they call up to say, I've just got the V6 blue screen of death, you've lost it for 2 years. Your revenue margin won't let you do this easily. So this regime is horrible. V6 is a really unattractive business proposition for the carriage provider. Oops. So what are they going to do? How could you make V4 last forever? Well, I got out my crayons and drew a 7-layer stack. Does anyone remember this? It was all the rage in the 1970s, which means because it was in the 1970s, if you Google for it, you'll probably never find it. Because, of course, anything that was before 1980 doesn't exist because Google hasn't indexed it. So, there you are for information. That's a 7-layer stack, isn't it cute? Service, presentation, blah, 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 down to physical. Now, the issue is that the telephone companies very rapidly figured out that users only pay for services. It's not that you paid 25 cents for a phone call or whatever you paid because that's what it cost. Crap, that was what it was worth. And you paid $10 a minute to phone somewhere in the south of Pacific. You paid that not because that's what it cost, because that's what it was worth. So the telephone companies were very good at vertical integration and cross-subsidization. They made all the money in novel and innovative services like 1-900 and fax, and used those mountains of money to subsidize every other part of their activity. That's what vertical integration was all about. That's why, collectively, they were the largest single enterprise on the planet. That's why AT&T was so big back in 1984. Charge for services and cross-subsidise everything else. That's not today, is it? We deregulated. Where's the money? Not in the carrier business. It's in the content business. All the money is over there in service. But because they're not vertically integrated, none of the money goes down the elevator shaft to anywhere else. None of it. It stays up there in service, which is just fine if that's your business. And over-the-top provisioning, whether it's Netflix, Pandora, Google, Amazon, you name it, all operate in precisely the same business model. And they're driving trucks, basically, through the nightmare of trying to run the rest of the infrastructure without structural cross-subsidization. And the one thing telephone companies are lousy at is transformation to be utility companies. They still dream for those gold-plated taps in the bathroom. They lust after them every time they wake up and every time they go home. If only they got their money back. So where's the money to invest in V6? They haven't got it, but oh, they want it. So rather than looking at life in such a depressing way, let's try and look at it in a different way. Because I'm sure somewhere there in the access carriage market, someone is preparing a PowerPoint slide that looks a lot like this. Only they didn't use crayons, they used lots of colours and fancy fonts, because that's what makes it believable. So what actually happens out there in the economy? There are a whole bunch of users who pay you money because you're an access provider. If you're really lucky, you might get $30 a month from each of them. And what about all the services they use? Do they pay you? Of course not. It's called net neutrality or something. You're not allowed to bias the picture. You provide service to everyone, be they Netflix or Google or Pandora or anyone. You get your money from access, services go and do what they do, everyone's happy except you, because that's not enough money. Then along comes address exhaustion. And all of a sudden, you're running a constriction point. Because when you put in that CGN, what you're actually doing is rationing access. I like you. You can have 20 ports for your service. You're not paying me enough money. You only get one port. Tell you what though, I can make it 20 if you pay me. And if you don't like that deal, if you don't like paying me to get access, I'll sell you a rack in my network over there where the users are. My rates are wonderful. They're only $1 million per rack unit per week, and that's not negotiable. All of a sudden, address exhaustion gives you the ability to do monetary extraction from those remote service providers because you are the toll gate. All of a sudden, you've reinvented a concept that has been around for centuries in that endless battle between carriage and content. In the battle that got played out in the railroad systems, in the battle that got played out on the canalways of England in the 19th century, and the battle that is now being played out in the fibre high roads of today's network. Because all of a sudden, in a world of scarcity, net neutrality is a myth. I can't do it anymore. I have no addresses. It's not possible. Now, all of a sudden, everyone has to pay to get access to my customers. And it's really simple. If you don't, that aperture that I control, that I have to make money on, is going to work against you as a service provider. Some might call it blackmail. Others might call it a way of making V4 last forever. So is it possible, is it conceivable that some of these access providers are so venal they might want money, and they might do almost anything to get it from folk who aren't around paying them? Oh yes. And it's not just feasible, it's happening now. Because that's the current play that is happening in front of our eyeballs. That's the current play that takes open networks and hermetically seals them so that even the devices aren't open, let alone the carriage networks and services behind them. We are, with meticulous accuracy and depressing inevitability, recreating the world of the 1970s. With that depressing thought, let's go back to where I was. Because we're trying to transition to V6, aren't we? We're not trying to rebuild the 1970s, I would hope. So, you know, we've got this minor problem that both sides, over there in transit land, they understand and are doing that. And down there in your device, they understand and have done it. And we're trying to look at the air gap and saying, how can you transition these access carriage providers across into V6? How can we make sure that we all actually end up with one network that is open? One network that doesn't require permission from every last NAT gateway on the planet to work. One network that allows creativity and innovation from each and every one of us. One network that addresses what I think is appropriate, a V6 network that actually allows you not to regard addresses as the aperture or shutter of a new monopoly. So, how do we do that and not try and optimize CGNs and try and actually perfect the application level gateways of this world? That's a really hard question. It's a really, really hard question. Because in looking at the IETF's efforts, in looking at our efforts in ARIN and APNIC and all the other RIRs, in looking at our efforts as a community, I'd have to rate us as an F. We're stuffed. We're doing really, really badly. It's a really hard question to answer because right now, 0.3% is not exactly a figure to celebrate. Progress at the customer edge, progress in the access network, I've written there glacial, but I'm tempted to write geological because we're moving at that kind of time frame. It will happen, but it's only centimetres per century. We're not doing this very well, are we? And somehow, we're not making the task any easier. Every day, we throw up more challenges rather than solving more problems. So let's have a look at some of these challenges just to actually make sure you truly understand what a bummer of a question this is. The internet is a child of deregulation, and the highly competitive environment that it's resulted in has been absolutely phenomenal. The changes in the last decade have been truly mind-blowing. I feel privileged to be part of this. In the same way that my mother first went to school on a horse and ended up doing cars and everything, planes and so on, the changes in my lifetime are similarly amazing. I don't know where I'd be without Google. I don't know where I'd be without GPS in my pocket, lost somewhere out there in Philadelphia. Those changes have happened rapidly and quickly, all because of deregulation and competition. But where are we now? Stop trying to think of the internet as an industry. It's not, shall we do V6 or shall we not? It's not as if this industry has one view. There are content providers, there are carriage providers, there are folk who build ASICs, there are folk who make CPEs, there are folk who make laptops, there are folk who make iPhones, etc., etc. Everyone is trying to compete. They're trying to compete ultimately for my money, but they're competing against each other as well. They're trying to optimise their own perspective. So every last approach is going to get explored by this industry inevitably. There is no plan. There is no plan. There is no monopoly telco saying, everyone, it's left now, we have to go down this street because that's where we're going. There is no plan. And there's no regulator to tell us what to do either. There's just market pressures. I have no idea how they will play out, and neither do you. No one here has any idea how they will play out. That's the problem. Secondly, I said I'd talk about V4 address exhaustion, so I suppose I'd better. That's actually the second challenge, and it's a bit of a ripper too, because the problem is we're not all running out at the same time. Here's APNIC. The blue line is basically the amount of addresses we had left, and that's time at the bottom. And that's about as good a definition of panic as you'll ever find. All of a sudden, when IANA ran out, everyone went, eek, and all of a sudden said, I need addresses. And so we gave out a phenomenal amount of addresses in the last few months. Fair enough. We're now down to our last /8. Fine. What about the others? Gee, ARIN's got 6 /8s left in its pool. RIPE has 4. LACNIC and AFRINIC similarly. And if I do a bit of maths, that stuff that Todd told you about yesterday, least order best squares fit and so on, do first order polynomials, do a weighted squares fit and so on, the answers are pretty simple. You're going to run out sometime, and I can actually tell you approximately when. In RIPE's case, with its 3.91 /8s, it looks like right now you're going to run out in June of next year. It used to be March, but the Greeks have done you a favour. Send them a thank you card next time you see them. And for Lacnic and Afronic, well, that was always going to be out there in 2014. Aaron's surprising. All of a sudden, Aaron, which encompasses around 350 million folk with an appetite for iPhones, iPads, Androids and everything else that squeezes into your pocket, all of a sudden you're not giving out addresses. Those 6/8s will last you, and you won't get down to your last /8 until October 2014. And doing a lot more maths and variability analysis, blah, 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 I can actually give you some uncertainty figures. But right now, yeah, the rest of the world, apart from Europe, is going to run out way over then. And if you can persuade the Greeks to really default right, you might get another 6 months out of this. So what? This is all very fun and lots of maths, but what does it actually mean? Well, I think this industry has its quota of 2-year-olds. Because you really have a hard time with reality sometimes. I keep on seeing the press, and network world, I must admit, and I hate to vilify them, but they're one of the classics, is still talking about IPv4 exhaustion as a sort of sometime in the future problem. And sitting there in the Asia Pacific knowing that it's happened, I find this kind of weird, because for me, it's history, not a future. So, I kind of think this industry has a whole bunch of folk who think, well, if it hasn't happened to me, it hasn't happening at all. And all of a sudden, you don't believe it until it's actually on you. And what happens to others is other people's problem. It's a network, guys. It's a network. What happens to me affects you. What happens to you affects me. But this industry, despite the fact it's a networking industry, has a massive credibility problem to itself. We create our own myths that MPLS is really good, that VPNs are wonderful, that we can make this stuff work, that we can do routing systems that leap over tall buildings and talk to applications on the fly. We create these myths and then believe them. Reality is a lot harder most often. And those varying address exhaustion timeframes have their own sets of problems. So let's explore them, because regional diversity is about to rear its ugly little head. Let's go back to that black hole of death, that transition loop, and actually look at each of these regions as they progress through. If you want more addresses in the Asia Pacific region, there's a simple answer: no. Or you can buy them, or you can try, but there are very few sellers out there. So the basic answer is no. So what are you going to do? Next year, Apple believes it's going to sell another 220 odd million of their devices. Android's going to sell another X million of those, etc., etc. The silicon industry doesn't care. They're still going to produce the same volume and more next year as this year. They're still on their way. So what's the industry in Asia Pacific going to have to do? Because they can't just transition to V6. That's not going to work. So, hello, Mr. CGN vendor. I'd like you to ship me a truckload. Make it 2 truckloads. I'm getting desperate. And then if you sort of drive it through to next year, the folk in Europe and that set of businesses have exactly the same problem. Because the basic answer is, I want more addresses. Dear Mr. Right, no. Not, I'll talk about it, no. And all of a sudden they're exploring that same dark space of what happens when you truly run out of addresses and have to completely change your capital investment strategy inside your network and start down this weird IPv4 forever track. And you keep on playing it further, and each of us are going to be exploring these things at different speeds and different places. One network, one internet, one Google, one service, or not. Because all of a sudden, things will look different. Very, very different. Because of different market pressures. Each of those places is going to start devising solutions because, well, good or not, we are very creative people. We will solve our problems day to day because we have to. But will it actually result in one network? What's the rate at which those differing trajectories actually creates different outcomes in each region? Will we still end up with one network as a result of all this? There's another human myth. The human myth is that we can make long-term plans. Again, one of these things I keep on hearing on mailing lists is that transition's going to take a long time. 5 years, maybe 10. V4 will be with us forever. Transition is a very, very long-held thing. You know, it's going to take an awfully long time. So think back to 2006, each of you. What was your long-term plan then? Not your idea of what it was now. What was your long-term plan then? And are you still committed to it? Let me stretch you a bit. How about your 10-year plan 10 years ago? What was your long-term plan then? I've forgotten mine, and you've forgotten yours. The longer the transition, the more likely you're going to forget that it was meant to be a transition at all. Because at some point, you just lose the plot. Because no one maintains consistency. This is a bunch of folk who are continually distracted by light and motion. Whatever comes in through the door and flitters in front of your eyes, something else. Let's perfect CGNs. Let's make ALGs work. We don't maintain trajectory over long periods of time. We're just that kind of industry. So how's the network going to fare? Well, badly. Because we're going to be heading off in different directions, and IPv6 is going to recede off to the closest galaxy. Because the longer it takes, the less the probability you're ever going to maintain trajectory. So this regional diversity actually means you're never going to come out of this in an assured fashion that it's all going to be one network at the end. Market pressures over extended period are going to make it tough. So that's the extent of how difficult this problem is. It is mind-bogglingly hard. So it's one of these if-then kind of statements. I liked the last 10 years. I had a ball. I hope you did too. You look as if you have. Nanog is a healthy organisation, and Aaron, because you're having fun. Because open and accessible networking, the vibrancy of competition, the ability to come in with a new idea and sell it to your peers, just makes life exciting and wonderful, doesn't it? We like it. Customers love it too. As a customer, I'm in awe of what you guys have put in my pocket. It's brilliant, right? I want more. So do our customers. They want more too. But we need for that open, accessible networking, not permission-based 1970s greyness. And if you need that, I'm sorry, IPv4 Forever is not an option for you. Because that option's only an option for the carriage providers to reattain a rather grey ascendancy. If you want something different, how are we going to get there? How are we going to make that happen? How are we going to help the internet through this transition, or at least not stuff it up completely? Yeah, I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea, which is really sad. But maybe I'm just this person of a very small brain, and maybe somewhere out there someone's figured it out. But if you have, you've kept it a secret from the rest of us. Because only 0.3% of the network is actually going anywhere useful. The rest is jammed in that transitional white space. I have no idea how to fix this. None. And neither does anyone else, as far as I can see. Whether you go up to IGF meetings, whether you go to the OECD, no matter where you go, even to the IETF, you see confusion and a certain amount of fear and panic, but you certainly see confusion. What you don't see is clarity. So I can't offer you solutions, and I won't pretend to. What I will do is give you just a couple of thoughts that for the folks staying here through Aaron might be of some help, and for the rest of you going home after Nanog, you might want to think about, because I hope they're going to be useful. So 3 thoughts. Solving your problems isn't enough in networking. It's a network. It's not just you. So you have to think about a common interest, not just local or self-interest. It's a world. There are 7 billion others of us out there. You have to think about all of us and stop trying to solve a local problem. Because if you merely solve a local problem at the expense of everyone else, there will not be one network at the end of this. not. We built the 1970s deliberately. 1980s in networking was a nightmare. We can do it again, and we will, if we don't start acting together. We have to make common interest work in convergence with local interest, because it is a deregulated market out there. No one's telling you what to do. You have to figure out, each of you, where common interest lies, because if you don't, we won't have an internet. We won't have an open network, we won't have a neutral network, and we won't have an accessible network for us or our children. Keep an eye on the bigger picture. It's not just you, it's not just North America, it's everyone. There are too many men in this industry, way too many men. Why I say this is that after watching my wife go through childbirth 3 times, I have to say that no woman would ever want pain prolonged. Pain is best experienced very, very shortly and gotten over with as quickly as possible. Why? Because pain is terrible, and scarcity produces pain and uncertainty. So if you try and prolong scarcity, then all you're doing is prolonging pain and prolonging uncertainty. So the harsh lesson here, and I refer back to at least 3 years of tortured policy discussions, is that scarcity and fairness are not synonyms. You can't be fair when there's scarcity. Stop trying. You're wasting your time and prolonging pain. And the longer you make this industry suffer, and the longer you offer the illusion that V6 is something I can defer to tomorrow, the longer you increase the levels of uncertainty that folk are going to build wacko solutions just for themselves. The longer we prolong this effort, the higher the probability you're never going to come out of it with one network. The transition process is going to get randomly uncertain all over the world. That's not a good thing. So for my third thought, I would actually say, stop trying to ration out the last few addresses. Not only are you wasting your time, you're actually working against your own long-term interest. Bring it on. Make it happen. Because the faster we can get over this, the faster we can actually move on. Because the more time, money and effort you distract this industry and offer them the illusion that there's still one more address they can get their hands on, I can defer V6 for another few hours, the longer you create that diversion, the worse it all gets. All you're doing is causing pain to your customers and a higher risk of yourself actually losing the plot. The chances are, if you continue down this track, V6 will be a fleeting illusion and we're all stuffed. Thank you. Now, normally at this time I'd be tempted to cut and run, but I will take some questions and try and defend them.
Thanks, Geoff. That was a great presentation. I have a really bad question. At what point would I said Bill Norton? At what point would you say V6 has failed? We need to work on something to replace that.
I'm sorry, that's not an option for this industry at this point in time. We don't have time left. We honestly don't. If we lose the momentum of an open network now, the only thing that is going to recreate the environment we enjoyed the last time is a new technology that is a minimum of 1,000 times cheaper per unit cost than the current one. The internet only took over telephony because it was really, really cheap. If you rebuild the walls of monopolies around the current framework of V4, the only way we're going to dismantle it in the future is by some super-duper technology that is 1,000 times cheaper. And guess what, guys? Neutrino-based networking won't work in the near-term future, and I have no faith in quantum networking. So, Bill, go and research, have fun, but don't make the rest of us wait for you. We don't have that time. And what we're going to build instead, I think we will regret. I'm sorry, the bandwagon is it's V6. That's all we have.
Middle microphone there.
John Curran, President and CEO, Aaron. 2 quick questions, Geoff. regarding your final couple of slides. The first one is you discuss it's not worthwhile to try to conserve those final addresses. And I guess in ARIN, of course, we now are issuing them in 3-month blocks. I guess I'm wondering, if we were to issue them in 12 months or 24 months, would it actually change anything? Because the address space would still be in the ISPs. It wouldn't be visible to ARIN, but it would still be being used for v4 services, just not in a way that everyone else would see. Is the appearance sufficient to make it worth considering?
Personally, yes, I believe so. That I think this long-term death that you're doing inside ARIN and RIPE of prolonging the agony is sending false signals all over this industry.
Okay.
So my own view, and it's a very personal view, is just simply bring it on. There is no alternative out there. Rationing is a very strange outcome. As any economic theorist would tell you, once you start rationing a resource, everybody gets less than what they wanted. Oddly enough, in your effort to be fair, you've pissed everybody off. And I'm sorry, that's probably not the most constructive outcome for us as an industry. So it's not ARIN doing this or ARIN doing this. Don't forget, this is all industry self-regulatory measures. But guys, you've got to think about the entire picture, not just trying to perfect scarcity and perfect this transition, but beyond that. So I would actually say, bring it on, make it fast, let it happen.
Thank you.
Michael Sinatra, ESNet. Thanks, it was another great presentation. When I look at the part where we sort of circle around for the transition and then kind of go off around the CDNs, it makes me kind of think of the work that Van Jacobson and others are doing with content-centric networking and NDN. And the idea of getting rid of addresses altogether is kind of interesting. And I was wondering what you thought of that. I mean, you kind of answered it a little bit when you answered Bill's question, but do you think that we might end up kind of, if things diverge for a while, could we converge along something along those lines? Is that a possibility?
Architecturally, it's very possible, but it's the business side of this you've really got to worry about. Akamai basically started populating the rack space inside ISPs and paid the ISP nothing because the ISP couldn't sell it any other way. But in a world of scarcity, all of a sudden that rack space assumes an incredible value. And you could call it extortionate pricing. But what's going to happen is those architectures will start to exist and service providers will be forced to pay an excessive, onerous and dismal toll. And the lifetime that we've enjoyed in the last few years of abundant, vibrant service will vaporise. Great architecture, shocking business model. Somehow we need to make both things work, not just one.
Thanks.
Thanks.
It's Vince Cerf from Google. That was a wonderful talk, as always, Geoff. A couple of thoughts. First of all, you mentioned massive expenditures to implement IPv6. We haven't experienced that at Google. It's taken time, but it hasn't taken huge amounts of cost. So if you have, I don't know that you could respond on at the moment, and maybe it would be better if you did something later, to say something about why that's such a massive investment you think is needed. I have a couple of other questions, but I'll hold them until you answer that one, if you want to.
Part of the cost right now is actually dealing with the help desk calls of customers. They typically cost somewhere between $60 and $65 to answer with someone who speaks English and vaguely competent in this country. And in many other countries, it's the same problem. So if you have 3 or 4 calls in setting up V6, you've just lost everything. And that kind of cost of $100 to $200 per customer isn't necessarily in your network. It isn't even necessarily in doing the CPE. It's all the ancillary costs of supporting folk whose passion isn't networking. Their passion is speaking and talking and communicating, and the equipment isn't doing what the damn thing was meant to do. So they ring up their service provider, and all of a sudden the meter starts ticking. That's where the cost lies.
Okay. If I'm permitted, may I ask a couple more questions? The other thing which strikes me as being on target is that economic arguments are the only ones that are going to win here. And you've already made the strong point that scarcity creates opportunity for the network suppliers. There's an element of scarcity that I don't remember if you mentioned. That's the routing tables. When we run out of those, they start charging for that. That becomes a big issue. the question then is, what economic arguments can be mounted that will persuade the network providers that their interest in scarcity should be overtaken by the utility of getting to a uniform end-to-end network? We have to convince them that it's in their economic interest to build the network we want, not the network that they think they like.
It's a very good question, Vint, and one that I've grappled with for many years, and I don't have an answer. I actually lean towards the theory that that particular part of the puzzle is what is technically called a market failure, where open economic forces actually don't optimize a solution in line with public interest. And that all of a sudden, when you get market failure, you actually need various forms of intervention, public good economics, to actually try and correct what you think is anomaly in the public interest. So in other words, these folk will solve the problem, but in ways that I think are weird, perverted, and create an unnatural control over everyone else. I suspect there is a role there for some form of public interest to be expressed in where we're going. We've already seen legislation around network neutrality. We've already seen that this network doesn't operate in a complete vacuum of public interest. But we're now inside a deeply technical area, with a deeply political or at least regulatory problem, and somehow we have to persuade the regulator that yes, you may have botched up the deregulation of AT&T. You may have done a hideous mess with trying to fight with Microsoft, but don't give up. You're not completely incompetent. This time we really need something constructive. And it might be asking folk who are already gun-shy, but we do need more folk to look at this from a wider perspective. It is a business failure as much as anything else. And our mechanisms to get through this, I think, Vint, are going to involve a lot more stakeholders than just the industry players alone.
We have a comment over there, and we're running a little bit tight on time, so these are going to be the last three comments over here.
Mike Laverne from Dine. I know at my house I actually run IPv6 on my home network alongside of IPv4 because I have to in order to get an internet connection. Do you think it would be helpful to have more consumers educated on why IPv6 is better and actually have the consumers have a voice to the ISPs? Do you think that would help the process along, or is that even plausible?
I don't think it's plausible, and I don't think it's going to work. And partly, I suppose, the reason why I come from that is actually looking at the analog to digital conversion in free-to-air television that's happened over the last 5 or 6 years in many countries. That their ability to try and make the entire world change its however many billions of television sets and put set-top boxes has largely been a failure in terms of educating them on the technicalities. We've got down to the simple thing, you need a new set-top box, guys. And I think with V6 it's almost the same thing. You need a new CPE. That modem you had, get another. So educating them on that, I actually want to run a car. I don't want to know how internal combustion engines work. I just want to drive from A to B, etc. So, yeah, for geeks, different proposition.
Owen DeLong, Hurricane Electric. So if I understand the crux of part of what you were saying is there's essentially this run-out dispersion that is occurring where people are running out at different periods, and the farther apart that gets spread, the worse it is. Is that correct?
No, I didn't say the worse it was. I said that various industries will start to create solutions inside various regions. So right now, if you're looking inside China or any part of Asia Pacific, it's not a case of buying new more V4 widgets. It's actually a case of buying CGNs like crazy, because there are no V4 addresses. So what they're asking from their supply chains, what they're asking for the vendors, is actually inventive solutions around their current problem. But that's not what European providers are asking for. It's not what North American providers are asking for. So in 2 or 3 years' time, or in America's case, maybe in 10 years' time, whenever you get over this financial thingy you're in, whenever you get over it and you start going, oh, I need more networking, will you just buy what China bought? Or will you buy something completely different that works completely differently? And because we're all endlessly inventive folk, and we get needlessly distracted by the latest fly that wanders into the room, you're going to do something different. And the chances of interoperability, massive global interoperability, gets slighter the longer that dispersion, the longer the variance becomes. We might not end up with one network, Owen.
Okay, so given that it gets radically more different the longer that the dispersion gets spread out, what do we do to fix that? Because it seems to me that, issuing small blocks of address space over a longer period doesn't work out so well. Apparently, issuing smaller blocks at a time over the same period doesn't work so well, because that's your criticism of Aaron, whereas the small blocks over a longer period would be my criticism of APNIC. What is the good solution here?
I simply offered some observations on from where I sat, and that's the best I can offer this community. Thank you.
Hi, Alan Durand from Juniper Networks. I want to talk a little bit about the CPE issue. I speak to a lot of service providers in different regions of the world, and this is a topic that comes back over and over again. And that's really the gate to the adoption of V6. Because service provider may have V6, a content provider may have V6, I may have V6 on my laptop, but if the CPE doesn't do it, it's broken. So there are about 1 billion CPE out there in the world. It's about $100 per CPE, more or less, maybe. So it's about $100 billion proposition. So is it about time to ask the government to bail this industry out?
In 2006, you could have made that proposition and you might well have gone a long way with it. And then we had the GFC Mark I, and now we've manufactured the GFC Mark II. And as far as I can see, it might be a fine idea, but you go near any, at least reasonably, northern hemispheric government these days, and the basic answer you get is, we're broke. They just can't afford it. There is no such thing as such a massive revenue base to do this anymore. Unfortunately, what you'll get from them is all kinds of things except a check. Thank you.